Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the April speaker series on the 1st of May. It's a beautiful day. Thank you for joining us. Just wanted to give you guys an update on the events that are coming up next week, Tuesday, starting at 11, is going to be the moving of the Erie Canal Lieutenant Chief out of the long shed. So if you're available, I highly recommend coming out to see that. It's going to be a really kind of momentous occasion. And then at the end of the month, on the 25th, we are going to be inaugurating the Erie Canal Lieutenant Chief at Canalside in the commercial slip. So we welcome you to join us for that. I'd like to welcome Marla Segol, Professor of Global Sexuality and Gender Studies at University of Buffalo, and the Professor of the class of students that you'll be hearing from. Also very involved in the Erie Canal Lieutenant Chief Bicentennial Voyage project as well that we've been planning for 2025. So I'm going to hand it over to Marla. Thank you so much for all of your help, and we're excited for the to hear about your students' work.
Thank you, Eddie.
You're very welcome.
And thanks everybody for being here. I'm so thrilled to see you. I'm so glad that we have so many people interested in our work. I am going to just read a description of what we're doing tonight and talk a little bit about our methods, and then I'm going to introduce each of the students, and they will. We're not going to interrupt their presentations for introductions because we're going to do it now. Okay? So, nearly 200 years ago, after more than 3 decades of surveying and building, the Erie Canal was completed, and it opened with a fascinating month-long aquatic processional and a series of celebrations, culminating in an alchemical political ritual called the Wedding of the Waters. Both the construction of the canal and the performance of this ritual have become a key part of the history of New York State. Yet, these New York State histories have not yet told the stories of the many different groups of people who made it and were affected by it, or of its role in the history of science, the environment, and the development of religion. Truly, the Erie Canal changed the way we think and learn about the world, the way we do science, and the way we think about religion. This student roundtable presents and analyzes new and under-examined sources to tell the story of its cultural and intellectual legacy. So just to talk a little bit about our process, this semester we spent half the semester studying already published modern sources as well as well-known primary sources on the Erie Canal. However, for each class, students did research to find primary sources to add to our discussion, and they also found new primary sources to analyze on their own. And so today, they're going to present to you the fruits of their research labor. So with no further ado, I want to introduce them. I'm very excited about their work, and I'm very proud of it. So I'm so glad they're sharing it with us. Yeah. So first we have Fiona Serrano of the Departments of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies, History, English, and Jewish Studies. Yes, she can do it all. Next we have Maria Rendo of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies and Environmental Studies. Or excuse me, say
Environment and
Sustainability. Yeah. And Fiona, the title of Fiona's paper is A Fish in or Out of Water, Mordechai Noah and His Jewish American Identity. Maria's paper is entitled Planting Seeds, the Erie Canal and Women's Participation in 19th Century Science. Next we have Kayla Caraballo of Environment and Sustainability and Philosophy. environmental studies, and with a minor in philosophy. And Kayla will be presenting a paper called Burned Over, Indigenous Myths and Artifacts and New Religions Along the Canal. Brett Hayes is doing a master's in education social studies, and his paper is entitled The Erie Canal and Changing Conceptions of Scientific Truth. And finally, we have Hannah Gordon, a PhD student in global gender and sexuality studies, who is writing a middle grade novel about the children who shaped the Erie Canal, right? And so her title is The Children Who Shaped the Erie Canal, Readings from a Novel. And with no further ado, I present my speakers. Oh, and just a word on the format, they're gonna each read their papers. We can take 1 or 2 questions for each paper, and then the end we'll have a full discussion with the group, okay? So, go ahead. And I will get out of the way.
As Dr. Segol said, I'm Fiona, and my paper is titled
Can she stand up, please, so we can hear better?
Or grab the microphone, one or the other. This one.
Oh,
It's just not on there.
Yeah, turn them on.
Yeah.
Is this one on? Or this one's on? It's got
No,
to be
no,
on.
but this
So
one.
this is when we're recording for applications.
As Dr. Segol said, my name is Fiona Serrano, and my paper is titled A Fish in or Out of Water, Mordechai Noah and His Jewish American Identity. A beaver, a tank of fish, a bear, a cage of birds, and 2 Seneca boys in tribal dress get onto an ark. This is not the setup for a punchline, nor the biblical story. It is a boat in line for the procession of the finished Erie Canal on October 26, 1825. The ark was commissioned by Mordechai Noah, a prominent Jewish thinker who envisioned the canal as a means for American greatness. This vision not only included that of the American people, but Noah dreamed of curating a homeland for the Jewish people. There was no better place than America. It was a country that was built on ideas of equality. As a distinguished member of the Jewish community, he was deeply connected with the well-being of his people. His Jewish homeland was to be built on Grand Island, which he named Ararat. This is in reference to the mountain that Noah received the tablet from God. He included the Jewish people from around the world and the indigenous people that he believed to be the lost tribe of Israel. His speeches addressed to the Jewish community followed the same structure. He narrates the story of Jewish exile and diaspora and molding it to fit one of his vision of America. This is vital in understanding his identity and his role in his attempt to build American and Jewish culture simultaneously. Noah spoke at the consecration of the synagogue Sherith Israel in New York City on April 17, 1818. In that speech, he structured the Jewish identity in the same way, beginning to fit it within American identity founded in the values of religious freedom and equality. The Jewish diaspora was vital to this theory, as Jews suffered, as he wrote, 18 centuries of oppression and an unwearied persecution after having been driven from the land of their fathers and scattered to the most remote places around the globe. This has led God to direct a portion of his chosen people to this land of tolerance and liberal principles. The history of barbarism and intolerance has led Jews to settle in America, finding freedom from religious persecution and experience the founding of a new nation. According to Noah, Jewish persecution was also essential for the construction of America. As he wrote, the persecutors of the Jews ceased to exist, giving way to the foundation of a new country. He argues that the countries that were persecuting Jewish people were falling in status, allowing for a new country to rise. He began to construct the ideas of equality that were built into American government with that of the homeland for the Jewish people, although not necessarily calling for it directly. In this country, the Jewish people, he wrote, have been permitted to erect this place of worship to God's honor and holy name. And with stability, the Jewish people can closer practice the religious aspects that have been lost as continuing the Hebrew language, which he understood as enacting the American ideal of religious tolerance. On September 15, 1825, Mordechai Noah laid the cornerstone of the city of Ararat, located on Grand Island. His speech on that day was printed in the New York Evening Post on September 24, 1825, and around the world, from American newspapers to those in England, France, and Germany. It follows the same distinct writing format, narrating Jewish exile to the present-day diaspora. And he was primarily concerned with, he wrote, the present condition of our people around the world. But he built upon this from his previous writing pieces. In these writings, he was not just narrating Jewish diaspora and history, but instead he gave instructions on how to fix this issue. emphasizing the importance of this refuge and his stated goals. He argues why America served as a good homeland for the Jewish people and for those that it would serve. Noah's intention of building American and Jewish culture together are clear. In imagining the homeland of Ararat, Mordechai Noah connects the Jewish people from around the world, emphasizing their diversity and distance. He includes those in Crimea and Ukraine, and the present-day Vietnamese Jews, and the black Jews from Benin Island that he emphasized must have existed at the time of the first temple. He was specifically including groups of people that were notoriously left out from the diaspora community, and stressing his interest in the plight of all Jewish people. He welcomed all of these groups to his homeland to seek refuge. We looked at his speeches that are important to understanding the conception of the position of the Jewish people, but we return now to the boat in the procession as he dramatizes these ideas in his celebration of the completion of the Erie Canal. He had been talking about Jewish people, but let's remember that he has 2 indigenous boys on the ark. Why were they there? They were not indigenous animals or plants. They are not even male or female like the ark in the Bible. They are like him. Mordechai Noah deliberately included them as part of the Jewish identity. The lost tribes of Israel, he wrote, were a subject of deep interest to the Jews. But this was not a sole idea of Mordechai Noah's American Jewish story, but one that was popularized in the book A Star in the West by Elias Budnat. Published in 1816, this book draws on connections between indigenous practices and that of the Jews, as well as similarities in their history. Many of these authors argue that these groups practiced an uncorrupted Judaism superior to those that are currently practiced. A Star in the West reads that the indigenous peoples' language in their roots and idiom and particular construction appears to have the whole genius of the Hebrew, and that in both letters and signification, it was synonymous with the Hebrew language. A Star in the West also notes that there was once indigenous practices of circumcision that was lost through the passage of time. Mordechai Noah builds upon these arguments in his Grand Island address delivered on September 15, 1825 at St. Paul's Church to stake a claim and American identity. He wrote that indigenous people worship one supreme being as the fountain of life and the author of all creation. They believe themselves to be the chosen people of God, a belief held by Jewish people as well. Furthermore, they are divided into tribes and follow traditional religious fastings, sacrifices, and abstain from unclean things. Their traditions of burials and mourning exemplify their commitment to cleanliness like that of the Jewish community. Furthermore, the indigenous people's exile from their homeland resembled the Jewish experience. There were commonalities between these 2 communities that gave Mordechai Noah, as he wrote, reason to believe that their lost brethren were the ancestors of the Indians of the American continent. Mordechai Noah was not just interested in the often excluded Jews, but those that were lost from history. He was reconstructing the Jewish narrative to include all Jews in his homeland and sought to unify the Jewish people completely. There was no discrimination of how far removed they were from their Jewish traditions or where they resided. His homeland was inclusive and encompassed all that held or lost their Jewish identity, and this demonstrated Noah borrowing upon American ideals of equality in the community that he was curating. America served as the perfect place for Jewish people to find refuge, as ideas of equality were built into its structure. Its constitution began with all men are created equal and clearly stated that the country would practice religious tolerance. It was vital that the Jewish homeland resided in a place that was equal as to provide refuge and protection. Noah said in his speech at Grand Island that there were privileges that were afforded to Jewish people that were not in other countries. He wrote, "The lands Jewish people cultivate are their own. No sovereign or feudal lord or magistrate can wrest their property from them, and that no persecutions await them. People can freely buy and care for their land with no fear that they will lose it due to their identities." And he continues that these ideas of equality by stating that in no other country on earth can they enjoy in this respect equal advantages to those which we hold forth. Aliens can hold any quantity upon declaring their intention of becoming citizens. Jewish people settling on American land and wishing to become citizens was enough to award them this liberty that they had been denied for 18 centuries. This was not a possibility in other places that they resided, and exemplified America's religious tolerance. Jewish people's safety and stability validated America's claims towards equality, while America's structures allowed for their ability to thrive. Jewish people were safe to practice their religion and traditions. Noah said that here then, in this free and happy country, distinctions in religions are unknown, and here we enjoy liberty without litigiousness and land without oppression. Mordechai Noah believed that the Jewish people would be safe from persecution and equal in citizenship in America. The Erie Canal was built as a pathway to American greatness. It was, at the time, the largest canal in the world at 363 miles. It connected the oceans and eased trade and travel, and it served to raise America's status as a world power, increasing its technologic and economic capacity. Mordechai Noah recognized this and the distinct protections that were built within the system and sought to use it for the protection of his people. He was deeply involved in his faith and his community, and he aimed to further connect his people to their lost traditions. He sought to connect groups that were left out of the Jewish diaspora and reunite the community. America allowed for the thriving of Jewish culture, and similarly, this thriving legitimized the country's claim of equality. The building and consecration of synagogues represented the Constitution's call for religious tolerance and brought the ideals into practice. Mordechai Noah claimed a spot for the Jewish community in this newfound country, and the ark in the procession represented these two ideas. His inclusion of indigenous people solidified his claim to American identity and land. If indigenous people are Jewish, then Jewish people are indigenous to America. And Mordechai Noah dreamed that American greatness was founded in inclusion. Thank you.
Now we have time for one or two questions.
I definitely in the scheme of like the abolition during that time and the wholesale genocide of First Nations people, where did Mordechai square up with that?
He was definitely very aware that America wasn't equal. Like, his idea to build a Jewish homeland actually stems from both indigenous people and Jewish people being targeted by Christians to be converted. So he is aware that that isn't really the case, but it's the idea of equality that other countries are lacking is what he is using to get people to come here. And then if there's more of a Jewish community, they would be able to protect themselves. But he is very aware that their ideas are not really like real.
Hey, so we've been struggling with Director of Maritime Center, so this is definitely what we're talking about, with the two boys on the boat. And you just said that they included them because they were the lost tribe of East Israel, which is an interesting perspective, and I think, I didn't do the research, so I believe you. I guess what I'm concerned about is that how would you say he would reconcile having two boys, which have been pointed out to me by an indigenous person, as compared to a couple, an elderly, with a bunch of animals, and the perception of that? Did he just discount the Haudenosaunee in general, seeing that you're not even Haudenosaunee, you're Jewish? Do you think that was his perspective?
I'll be honest, I'm not really sure. I do think it's important to know that he is a rich man or was a prominent man and had a lot of power. Like, even when he lost all of his money, there were people that were taking care of him. He was able to skirt by going to prison, so he definitely had a lot of privilege. I'm not necessarily sure he thought of that. I think he was just thinking of his.
I'm so looking forward to you telling me, actually, here's what the answer is.
You're one, I'm very sorry. What do you do?
No. But when we were talking about it, you said it matters, right, in your paper too. You said it matters that they're not, male and female couple like the animals,
Yeah.
but they're there together as maybe even citizens, right? That's what you told me.
That's kind of how I heard it, was that he picks children instead so that they are separated.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think he really thought
Because
that far.
what's been
what it
pointed
looked
out to
like.
us is that the same sex, obviously today is different, but they could not reproduce, and that was symbolic. Right?
Yeah.
So I was just gonna, if you had more insight on that.
No, I think that you can take it multiple ways. I don't think he necessarily meant it that way, because he's very clear that he thinks indigenous people are Jewish. So, like, he very much deeply believes in that, and I don't think he from my understanding and reading his work is, I don't think he necessarily thought of that. But he is a very privileged man, so.
Do you think he meant to absorb indigenous culture into Jewish identity? That was part of the question. Do you think?
For sure, yeah. I think I touched on it, but it goes deeper in the project that a lot of these people that are saying this are also saying that indigenous people are practicing an uncorrupted Judaism. So, yeah.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
it's very complex.
Yeah, it's, word is going around these days.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next we have Maria with Planting Seeds.
Hello. Okay. So my paper is more tangentially related to the Erie Canal, so I won't be talking about a boat like Fiona did, but I really like your presentation. Okay. So my paper is on women's participation in 19th century science.
A little louder and a little closer.
You got it. Women have been credited with being respectable admirers and hobbyists of botany, distinctly during the 18th and 19th centuries. They've been referred to by scholars as amateur scientists, botanizers, and a generally unrecognized constituency, but rarely are they considered respectable discoverers or contributors of botany. Discovery was a claim exclusive to scientists of the century who were by definition men. But this, of course, was not the case, as women have been involved in the production of scientific knowledge as long as men have. Scholars have not sufficiently noted this, often diminishing women's botanical involvement as peripheral contributions or phenomenal hobbies, as opposed to legitimate contributions of knowledge. A leading scholar of women's participation in botany throughout 19th century America, Emanuel Rudolph, observes that following the Civil War there was a swelling interest in botany, mostly due to college education becoming accessible to some women. While this is certainly true and a very valuable observation, it's concluded from a narrow assumption of what qualifies as contribution, as Rudolph uses women's formal education and involvement in botanical societies as evidence. By revisiting what has counted as a significant contribution, botany in early America reveals overlooked histories of women's contribution. With this new consideration in mind, it can't be ignored that following the canal's construction, there was a swell similar to that of the Civil War. This constituted of not only women's interest in botany, but also contributions of knowledge only dismissed as interest or left to the footnotes. I'll discuss the following two ways that women contributed to the scientific knowledge building of botany during the early 19th century following the Erie Canal's construction. The first is through a literary genre authored by women educators, and the second accounts for uncredited plant specimen contributions. These are by no means the only ways, but rather some examples and patterns of overlooked and worthy contribution and recognition. Even if they lie outside of a scientist's recognized legitimacy, outside of involvement in botanical societies or clubs, and outside of any formal botanical education. I'll start with talking about the literary genre of introductory botanical texts women authored. And I'll later reference writings by Jane Kilby Welsh, who was born in 1783, died 1853, and Almira Hart Lincoln Phelps, born 1793, died 1884. Both of them were pupils of Amos Eaton, a renowned naturalist and educator who lived from 1776 to 1842. Jane Welsh's Botanical Catechism, published in 1819, and Almira Phelps's familiar lectures on botany from 1829 demonstrate the adaptation of Amos Eaton's botanical genre to an audience of women pupils and educators, a genre which is in itself a contribution to botany as it encouraged a continued interest in the subject for the remainder of the century. But what exactly makes this genre a unique contribution to knowledge? What makes it worthy of mention alongside other botanical texts of the time? For that answer, we need to start with understanding of what comprised Eaton's botanical literary style. Amos Eaton was often criticized for his literary style, and several of his contemporaries disapproved of his simple language for not being classical enough, for not adhering to highly specific and dense language to describe his specimens. Eaton's popular textbook was titled Manuals of Botany. It was published from 1817 to 1840 under 8 different editions, utilizing a simple style that the Troy newspapers praised but several botanists critiqued. For example, in an 1819 correspondence to a physician and botanist friend, John Torrey, Eaton responds to the recommendation that he alter his manual's language in the 3rd edition. Eaton's awareness and intentions for this literary style are clear as he writes in the letter that "you have advised me to make the next edition of the manual more classical. I might add a few things to make it a more servile imitation of those who are classical. but it would defeat the very object of its being to introduce any more technical language than is absolutely necessary. Eaton's purpose with this textbook was to write a book that was cheap and could be commonly understood, writing in an 1824 letter to that same friend that his book has merit, but it is not that of a botanist. It is that of a simplifier. Boys and girls understand all I write. I stand between you great folks and the common folks. For Eaton to not jump to claiming discovery, especially as a botanist and significant cornerstone actor in early 19th century science in the States, is an anomaly in the field. I mean, these people were really obsessed with taking credit over specimen. Discovery, it was often the way to legitimize your career if you were a botanist, but evidently Eaton cared more for the popularization of the field rather than his reputation as a scholar of it. This is further exemplified by Eaton's continued outreach to women educators and pupils at a time when the natural sciences was just being introduced into higher education, and very notably a time when women were not able to formally attend colleges or universities or even be involved in local horticultural societies. One of the several women who he was acquainted with was Jane Welsh. While information on Welsh is scarce, she likely attended a public lecture Amos Eaton held, contributing to her botanical interest. Her most notable contribution is her 1819 book, Botanical Catechism. And as Larson writes, a scholar of women's botany, Welsh is often delegated to a footnote. But Welsh's book is arguably the cornerstone to several more women authors of introductory texts, such as Elmira Phelps and Lauren Johnson. So while Eaton's manuals of botany were a significant deviation from other books at the time, he encouraged Jane to write her book, Botanical Catechism, as a precursor and further reaching introduction to botany. Eaton even promoted her book in his own, titled Botanical Exercises, which was published in 1820, a year after Welsh's. In his book's introductory address to teachers, Eaton writes, "I should not omit a mention to a very meritorious little work, entitled Botanical Catechism, published at Northampton, 1819. It is the best book for very young students, particularly for ladies' schools. It was written by Miss Jane K. Welsh of Northampton, Massachusetts." Eaton's acknowledgement that Welsh's work was the best for introductory students is easily observable. Welsh's book takes a question-answer format. The following is a question from her book under the section Subdivisions of the Staminas or Stamens. Welsh's questioner asks, of how many parts does the stamen consist? To which she provides a sample answer of 3, the anther, the pollen, and the filament. When compared to Eaton's manual, which in most editions after a short introduction reveals a list of plant classes and orders in Latin, Welsh's is exceptionally beginner-friendly. Eaton knew this, and as a popularizer of botany, he encouraged this expanding subgenre of elementary instructional botanical texts, later also promoting Elmira Phelps's 1829 Familiar Lectures on Botany, which contained an elementary system of botany's grammar. In a footnote to the 3rd edition of Eaton's Manual of Botany, he provides a supplemental material to make his book easier to understand. This is where he writes, Mrs. Lincoln of Troy Female Seminary is preparing a familiar elementary system. Phelps was an educator and an author who was also sister to Emma Willard, principal of the Troy Female Seminary, which Phelps also was vice principal for. Though Phelps's book differs in instructional format from Welsh's Catechism by taking the form of accumulative lectures, it still falls under a similar style, though its purpose and intended audience are the same. Neither author claims notable botanical discoveries. Phelps herself writes in her familiar lectures that, with respect to botanical facts, I have no claim to discoveries. Neither have I ventured to make any innovations upon the science itself. Then, what contribution does her book, along Welsh's, provide? Phelps practically answers that part of this question herself, writing that, with respect to the style of her book, whatever may be its merits or its faults, the arrangement of the work and the application of botanical facts to the mind, either with a view of strengthening its reasoning faculties or to inspire devout affection, I consider myself responsible. Both Welsh and Phelps's style of their works maintain this audience of young women in mind. And while Eaton encouraged them to publish for many reasons, I'd argue that Welsh and Phelps could write to an audience of young women that Eaton himself knew he could not reach. Even if women had not been instructed by them, simply seeing that a book was by a lady, as Welsh's earlier printings of her books say, or by Miss Lincoln Phelps, offered something new to introductory botanical texts of the early 19th century. Eaton's promotion that their books were almost necessary to his Manual of Botany opened an avenue of not only introductory botany to women, but also texts like Eaton's so they could advance their studies. These young women were also an audience who often attended public lectures. As Phelps writes in a letter recalling the 1830s that the lecture room was filled with young girls, radiant with bright eyes and glowing cheeks, eager to obtain their share in the distribution of the fresh flowers which had been collected as the subjects of the lecture. While Phelps and Welsh served as notable authors who contributed through the style of their books, other contributors, which I'll call footnote women, deserve equal recognition. Footnote women in this context are simply women who have been mentioned in passing, usually in association with respected botanists who take credit for their work. A notable example of this is Jane Colden, but as her time was one before the canal's construction, I will not tell her story, but if you ask me about her, I will tell you about her. But I'll focus on two examples of footnote women in the New York Farmer and Horticultural Repository, published annually by the State's Horticultural Society from 1828 to 1836. This repository congratulates women on several accounts, from their superior gooseberries to the best leghorn hat, or even the second best leghorn hat. While it's all very interesting, I'll prioritize two examples in which women present the scientists with botanical specimens. The first is written in the second volume of the repository from 1829, and this is what's written. Some roots of the present and another species were presented to Mr. Anderson by Miss Oriana Georgiana Reinagle, who received them from Miss White, daughter of the Vice Consul at Valparaiso. We hope Mr. Sweet will take the first opportunity of dedicating a genus to each of these young ladies. It is unlikely that Mr. Sweet gave much credit to Miss Oriana or Miss White beyond naming a genus after this woman, and this happens again later in the third volume of the repository in 1830, when the authors write, "We feel much pleasure in calling this magnificent flower an American seedling. We have procured a cut for it for this number of the repository, from a drawing made by Miss Manley of this city." Arguably, this example credits the women more than the former one, but again, the presentation of a specimen is seen as a helpful aid towards a scientist's discovery and not worthy of any larger recognition within botany. Today I presented to you the introductory botanical texts of Jane Welsh and Elmira Phelps, both strongly influenced and encouraged by Amos Eaton. Alongside their contribution to a unique mode of instruction for women, I've teased at the existence of even more contributors, the footnote women. As authors, Welsh and Phelps's texts demonstrate an emergence of a necessary genre, one which reached larger audiences that, to a greater extent, comprised of women. As women with botanical interests, Miss White and Miss Manley in the New York Repository demonstrate contributions which, if you blink, you might miss. Women's contribution to knowledge in these examples exists within literary genres and knowledge sharing, outside of journals for science, and predating admissions to university, colleges, and formally recognized botanical clubs or societies. By revisiting these histories helps us reimagine what may have been overlooked or seen as insignificant because they exist in the forms of literary genres and other non-formal sharings of knowledge. Thank you, and remember that any flower you see this spring was probably admired obsessively by at least one young lady of the early 1800s.
Questions? Oh, one and two.
I'd like to hear about Colden. I forget
Oh
her
my
first name, but I
god,
mean,
Jane Colden.
that breadcrumb we have to follow.
So she's kind of an interesting case of botanist because she was very isolated. She lived in the country. Her father was actually, she was the aunt to the Cadwallader G. Colden that a lot of people know, because her father was Cadwallader Colden. And he was the governor of New York State at the time. And she spent a lot of time outside by herself, and her father encouraged her a lot. He would correspond with a lot of botanists in Europe. And she was really good at using the Linnaean classification for plants. So, like, there were botanists in Europe really hyping her up. They're like, oh my god, like, this girl, she's so good at using, like, the Linnaean system to classify these plants. So they were really eager to get their hands on her descriptions for them. And her father would send them her descriptions of the plants. And they would use her descriptions in their work but wouldn't credit her at all, which I think is just ridiculous. But her surviving work is a manuscript of botany, and she's got drawings and really awesome descriptions, and I believe it's in Europe somewhere, but I think that's an interesting case. And she's also considered the first American botanist, woman botanist.
Thank you.
Did any of the women that you studied their work in botany deal with family planning at all during that time?
I will say I didn't look at that specifically, but there is a lot of literature on kind of how the promotion of botany towards women kind of tried to prepare them for a domestic space, because botany is a lot about organization and sorting and that sort of thing. That was supposed to be good for your mind as a woman, because that would help you transfer those skills to the house, like the home. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of fiction during the early 1830s that kind of talks about women who are studying botany, a lot of it is kind of satire, that like if women get carried away and only study botany, then they can't properly tend to domestic kind of things and family planning. But I will say that I think, Jane Colden, back to her, after she got married, she stopped kind of studying botany, and she died in childbirth, so there's not much left there. But in terms of family planning, that's kind of all I've got. But yeah.
There were a lot of advertisements during that time about how to terminate pregnancies or prevent pregnancy, powders, elixirs, that kind of thing, and I thought,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
That's quack medicine, that wouldn't have been under botany.
Patent medicines, probably.
Yeah, patent, quack, whatever you wanna call it.
Yeah.
Can we do one more?
Yeah, it's about, during this period, it was about the time when the concept of science and scientists began to emerge. Before that, it was, you were a natural philosopher, you were someone who liked nature, was interested and curious about things. Did you find any obvious kind of translation of that language or development of that language watching these women? Did they just call themselves a botanist, not a scientific researcher, or any? I'm just curious how that.
Yeah, you're definitely right that a lot of them consider themselves like, natural philosophers. And I think that you see that a lot in the text, because I didn't talk about this, but Brett will talk about it more in his presentation, that there's a lot of theology in nature at this time. Like the way people are talking about botany, the way people are talking about nature. I mean, these texts were promoting theology in nature, theology in studying plants, that if you studied plants, you got closer to
This was the
God.
fight with Darwin. This is while Darwin was coming
Literally,
out, and this
yeah.
is the evolution as opposed to creationism, that God created this, there was nothing evolved about it, this is how God created it, so.
Yes, though ironically, a lot of those texts will just say that you can study God's creation more closely if you look at nature, which is really interesting because I think people do think of science and nature and God and theology is very, very much dichotomous, but it's not. Yeah. So that's my response. Yes.
Thank you. Don't forget, when everybody's done, we'll have a really open discussion. So if you didn't get to ask your question, you'll still get a chance. Taylor Carroll.
Hi, this is my favorite. So, for the vast history, the Erie Canal is known for its vast history and contributions towards the improvement of transportation in New York State. However, one contribution that is not regularly mentioned is its contribution towards religion. For my project, I researched the religious history of the canal and the impact the indigenous people had on the different religious communities forming along the canal route. Although there are many, I'm focusing on Mormonism for this particular presentation just to make it a bit smaller. But the building of the canal brought in the need for what essentially would be storytellers, and a lot of these storytellers happened to be preachers and priests and prophetess that were happening along the route of the canal. And the canal itself helped with the spreading of information. Obviously, it was essentially a super highway that was built across New York State. So the story that I was really interested in would be the Book of Mormon itself. I'm just going to read a passage or two passages from the book itself. The first one is Hillman 1:15, and it came down again that they might pitch battle against the Nephites, and they were led by a man whose name was Corantimer, and he was a descendant of Zaralma, and he was a dissenter among the Nephites, and he was a large and mighty man. The second verse, and they were large and mighty men as to the strength of men. So he's describing giants essentially. And to give context, the Nephites were what Smith believed to be ancient beings that were descendants of one of the lost tribes of Israel. And the Lamanites are what Joseph Smith believed to be the ancestors to Native Americans. So he believed that the ancestors to Native Americans eventually took over and destroyed the Nephites. This is just like indicative of the stories of indigenous people who occupied the area to the canal prior to the colonization of the Americas. Obviously, battles were fought, wars and civilizations were brought up, and Joseph Smith was looking at these different artifacts, and he was assigning his own form of lore, essentially, to these artifacts. And the burned over district represents, to me, the removal of indigenous people and the reinterpretation of their myths. And these were done by, famously, Joseph Smith was a treasure hunter or a money digger. And to give context about money diggers, the concept of treasure hunting has been present in the Americas since before the colonial times and even present in medieval Europe, as stated in Walker 1984. In England, ministers were referred to as wise men and wise women, and these people not only had the ability to locate buried treasure, but they could also heal the sick and tell fortunes. A lot of old European, Celtic, and German races used spiritualism to partake in money digging. These practices were continued on by American settlers, obviously after they came over. They for particularly interested in digging in areas with ruins or mounds or caves, and essentially looking for Christ in like many different ways. And so a lot of these folks practiced, I want to say, religious practices prior to money digging. So fasting sometimes took place, meditation sometimes took place, and all of these were done essentially to bring themselves closer to God, and they believed that Christ was attached to the earth, and therefore they can get closer to the fortunes that they can gather. These beliefs evolved as more myths about buried treasures left behind by Spaniards or a mythical pygmy race of people who left behind their treasures buried in a mysterious mound somewhere in upstate New York to prevent it from being stolen by invading giants. The most notable of these excursions would be the 150-foot high Mormon Hill or Cumorah Hill that is believed to be the site where Joseph Smith received his golden plates by using his seer stones. And seer stones were also typically, they could be just regular stones, but typically they were Native American artifacts that were found and essentially placed into a hat so that they can look into a spiritual realm, and so that they can be told where these different artifacts can be found. And that's what Joseph Smith famously used to find the tablets in the Book of Mormon. The treasure seekers saw themselves practicing a form of worship when they partook in these excursions. They believed that this would bring them closer to God and therefore closer to the treasures that lie below. Treasure seekers were looking for magical treasures that can bring them fame and fortune, and often known as money diggers, seeking coins, jewels, and mines and other valuable artifacts that could be sold. However, finding these treasures were very difficult, and this may include treasure seekers relying on those magical tools, as said before, such as earthen mirrors, seer stones, or divination rods that are either made from mistletoe or witch hazel. These tools were valuable, and you can see in one of my artifacts for this presentation, I found like a newspaper article about a money digging tool, which is actually a plow that was invented for farming, but they were advertising it as a useful tool for money digging. And this was published in the Palmyra Herald, July 24th, 1822. So it starts off, every country has its money diggers who are full of the belief that vast treasures lie concealed in the earth. So far from being a new project, its date and origins with the first man who ever wielded a spade. 'Tis as old as Adam and Eve. 'Tis as old as Adam. Even in these later days, we find men so much in love with the root of all evil, and so that it's firm in the belief that it may be dug up, and they will traverse hill and dale, climb the loftiest mountains, and even work their way into the bowels of the earth in search of it. And I'm not going to read the whole advertisement because it's very long, but essentially, what stood out to me was, I guess, the pervasiveness of money digging during the time. And I'm also going to go into a second article that was in the newspaper. During this time, there's also lots and lots of stories about Native Americans being present in this land and the different artifacts that they found. These stories very well could have been faked, most likely could have been faked because they were very overzealous, as you're going to read, as the one I'm about to read. The one I'm about to read was Poetical Descriptions of the Mammoth by a Shawnee Indian. 10,000 moons ago, when naught but a gloomy forest covered the land of the sleeping sun, long before the pale man, with thunder and fire at their command, rushed on the wings of the wind to ruin this garden of nature, when naught but untamed wanderers of the woods, and men as unrestrained as they are lords of the soil, a race of untamed animals were in being huge as frowning precipice. Cruel as the bloody panther, swift as the dissenting eagle, and terrible as the angel of night. The pines crashed beneath their feet, and the lake shrunk when they slaked their thirst. The forceful javelin in vain was hurled, and the barbed arrow fell harmlessly by their sides. The forests were laid at a meal. The groans of expiring animals were everywhere heard, and the whole village inhabited by men were destroyed in a moment. The cry of universal distress extended to the region of peace in the west. The good spirit interposed to save the unhappy. Forked lightning gleamed around, and the bolts of heaven were hurled upon the cruel destroyers alone. The mountains echoed with the bellowings of death. All were killed except one male, the fiercest male of the race, and him, and even the artilleries of the skies assailed him in vain. He ascended his bluest summit, which shades the source of the Mongolia, roared aloud, bid defiance to every vengeance. The red lightning scorched lofty firs, ribbed the knotty oaks, but only glanced upon the enraged monster. At the length, with maddened fury, he leaped over the waves of the west at a bound, and the moment reigns uncontrolled, the monarch of the wilderness. So this is about mammoth, a mammoth. The poem starts off with a quote, 10,000 moons ago, but not with a gloomy forest in this land. Before the pale man, with thunder and fire at their command, brushed the rings of the wind to indescribable nature. While his poem may seem simple, it reflects how people viewed Native Americans at the time. They viewed them as these ancient beings, these mythical beings who experienced the stompings of the mammoth, the true wilderness that was untamed and wild. At the time, this perception of amazement at these different cultures that they at the time believed were long gone. What stood out to me was the poem's mention of Christian imagery, most notably the angel of the night and the fork leaned down and the bolts of heaven. The bolts of heaven were hurled upon these cruel destroyers. These quotes were present throughout the passage. This poem could very well be written by a Shawnee man, which could also been as likely written by a white man about his fantasies about the wild Native Americans.